I'm really thrilled to be joined by Jim Zogby, who is someone I have just enormous respect for, and I've had the real privilege of getting to know over the years. Jim Zogby, as I'm sure most of you know, as the founder of the Arab American Institute, and he is also a member of the Democratic National Committee. And he made what seemed to me a courageous proposal about how the Democrats could choose a new nominee. So before we get into that, I just thought I would start with a general foundational question, which is, what does it mean to be a member of the Democratic National Committee, and how does this institution work?
First, let me say I am as enormously respectful of you, and I thank you for your kind words. But as you know, I've followed your career, and we did a show together on my old TV show back right after the Iraq War started, and I've just really been impressed with everything you've done and how you've transitioned from where you were in a republic to where you are today. And you're the courageous one. You are definitely the courageous one. The Democratic National, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for this, but I'm going to speak the truth because it needs to be spoken. The Democratic National Committee is about 440 people, most of whom are elected in their states or territories. There are national committee people, and there are chairs of the state parties and the territorial parties, and they become members of the Democratic National Committee. And then years ago, in order to create demographic balance, the party created an at-large category. And I'm one of those at large. I've been appointed by the chair for many years to create the correct distribution among races or genders, et cetera. The party in its bylaws is supposed to be the governing body. The DNC is supposed to be the governing body of the party, but it doesn't function that way at all. It's more like, I call it the Bulgarian Communist Party circa 1955. Everybody goes to meetings and nods. I'm Catholic, so I can say it. We're told when to stand up, when to sit down, when to clap, and when to leave. These are some of the really best people in the party that I've gotten to know, organizers of renown, people who've done pretty amazing things in their states. But at the meetings, there is no opportunity to engage in the process of governing the party. When I was on the Unity Reform Commission after the 2016 election, I said we should adhere to the bylaws that say the DNC should annually review the budget and evaluate the effectiveness of expenditures and the performance of staff. That was ruled out of order, never happened. I made a bit of a stink, went to the Rules and Bylaws Committee, got voted down. I've been on the DNC 31 years, have never seen the budget. I was on the Executive Committee 16 years. We've never seen the budget. Horrible things will happen. And I'll ask, we should have an internal review. Never happens. And so it is a body that is supposed to be the governing body, but it doesn't do that. It doesn't function that way. Instead, what happens is that when the Democrats hold the White House decides what we do. And I was chair of the Resolutions Committee for 11 years, and Barbara Lee would submit a resolution. And I'd say, let's consider this. No, the White House said we can't do it. So, and then when we're out of the White House, the previous White House still makes the decisions. And so there really is no autonomy on the party. When Jamie Harrison was first taking over as chair, he asked me, he said, I want to create a task force and I want you to chair it to what does it mean to be a member of the DNC? And I said, I'd love to do it. And I said, I'd like to also expand it to what does it mean to be a Democrat? I mean, other than being on a mailing list, being on a text message list, or being on a robocall list and be asked for money all the time, is there organic ties between the Democrats around the country like there used to be when I was growing up? And my mom was a precinct captain who walked door to door at election time, but also during the year to find out what people needed, et cetera. Went to the ward leader, who went to the party boss, who went to the mayor. That's how the party functioned. It was an organization. It's not that anymore. So I said, yes, I'd love to do it. He called me back a couple of weeks later and said the White House vetoed it. They don't want it. So it didn't happen. So that's a problem. I want the party to have a say in how the party functions. And this seemed to be an opportunity where the party could actually do something.
People should put questions in the chat. Just one very quick question before we get into the events of the moment. What is the relationship between being on the Democratic National Committee and being a convention delegate who participates in nominating the nominee for president?
DNC members and elected officials are what are called superdelegates. They are not part of the people elected around the country during presidential races. States have different rules. Some will actually have people run themselves. So if you run here in the District of Columbia, for example, you run on the ballot. You have to get signatures to run on the ballot. I'm running as a Jackson delegate, and you get voted. And so Jackson wins, but only the people who ran on his name who also won get to be delegates to the convention. And the top vote getters win, et cetera. Some states, the candidate wins. And then after the candidate wins, the party will get together and say, okay, candidate won 30% of the vote. That means he or she gets 2 delegates in this congressional district and 3 in that district and 1 in that district. And that's how it works. So the delegates to the convention are a product of the primary process and are apportioned as per the votes obtained by the candidates in that process. So, for example, uncommitted in Michigan got 15% in a couple of different districts. 15% in a congressional district means you get 1 delegate. So they got 2 in the state. In other states, for example, they got a greater percentage of the vote, so they got more delegates, but it's portioned out by the number of votes the winning candidates get.
Right. So tell me about the proposal that you made about how the Democrats could choose a nominee. What made you decide to do that? And then a little bit about how you proposed that it should work.
The debate did it. I was both sad and distressed, and a little bit angry that what is so much is at stake in this election, and that people would put President Biden in that position. They had to have known he wasn't in a position to do that. His people couldn't have been startled that, oh my God, look at him staring at the camera, slack-jawed. He was just not in the best place to be. And because I've been concerned for a couple of years, as many have, that he's not at the top of his game. He's had an extraordinary run in terms of domestic policy, obviously deep differences with him on foreign policy, but he deserved better than to be sent out there and have that in public display. So after that, I said, we have to do something. And I wrote a plan up that would empower the Democratic National Committee to initiate a nominating process to have an open convention, all of it predicated on if the president were to step down. I wrote it up, sent it as a letter to Jamie Harrison, New York Times.
Jamie Harrison is the head of the
Democratic National Committee. It got out. New York Times did a piece on it, quite nice. The Nation actually broke it with a Q&A with me, and then CNN, and we were off to the races.
Tell me about how you envision what you think that process should be.
First, what have to happen is the president step down. And the second would be that the DNC would meet and would outline a process. The reason I did it was because there were too many people who were saying, if it's not Joe Biden, all hell breaks loose. It's chaos. It's, whatever. And it's the end of the world. And I was like, that's not the first time people have played the Chicken Little game. You can't do it because all hell would break loose. I said, no, it's not. This is something that can actually happen. And the process would be that the DNC meets, the 440 members, and would come up with a plan that would say, if you want to run for president, you have to get 40 nominating signatures from DNC members that would include at least 7 from each of the 4 regional districts of the party, so that it wouldn't be Gavin Newsom just getting California and running. He'd have to get people from Rhode Island or people from the South or people from the Midwest, et cetera, and that would be true for everybody. They would then be certified by the party secretary. The certification would include a pledge that they would not run negative campaigns and would endorse the eventual winner. And the party would then hold 2 televised town halls where the candidates would be asked, why are you running? Why are you best to beat Donald Trump, et cetera? What are your policies on this, and that? And then we'd go to the convention. And at the convention, Joe Biden, having stepped down, would have released his delegates and the vote would ensue. It would sort of be like the Kennedy 1960, where it actually went to more than 1 ballot. And it was very exciting. And the network, I argued in the plan that the conventions, when I started in the 80s going to conventions, they were exciting events. And in order to ensure that nothing unpredictable happened, the parties increasingly scripted the conventions so that the more scripted that they got, the less coverage they got, because who wants to cover something where you already know what's going to happen and you know who's going to say what, because the speeches are all given out in advance. And so they basically have gone down from wall-to-wall coverage, which is what it was years ago, to maybe 2 hours, and some actually only do 1 hour. I thought this would be wall-to-wall coverage, and the networks, instead of the anchors talking to each other, would actually be on the floor talking to delegates. How are you going to vote? What do you think about this? And et cetera. And it would create an energy and an excitement that would showcase the Democratic Party as a truly Democratic Party
Mhm.
and would, in fact, I think, produce a nominee viewed as legitimate and exciting. I wanted to avoid the handoff thing, where it gets down to the wire and Biden says, I just can't do it and I'm going to hand it off to Kamala. I think that she deserves to be in the mix, and I think she probably would win. And I think she probably would do better at the convention than any other person who would get into the mix. But I think it would not serve her well, nor it would serve the party well if it were simply a handoff. And so I was looking for a process that worked. So my two goals were, one, to empower the DNC to finally do something.
Mhm.
And secondly, to create a process that produced energy and a legitimate nominee that could go forward and win. Those were the two goals.
And where do you think things stand now in terms of the likelihood that Biden will be the nominee? There have been various moments where it seemed like maybe a dam was about to break, but Biden has obviously pushed back very fiercely as he can, against this, as his people have. Where do you think things stand now?
I'm going to use a Catholic term,
So that's allowed.
purgatory or limbo.
That doesn't
It's
sound good.
it's sort of like when a little baby takes his first steps or her first steps.
Mhm.
You're watching, oh my God, I hope he doesn't fall. I hope it doesn't fall. Injured person gets the cast off and takes their first steps afterwards. It's the same thing.
Mhm.
We're going to be spending the next 4 months watching every single word. Did he say it right? Did he not say it right? Every step, is his steps confident or is it hesitant? What's this walking with his hands out in front for balance? I mean, those are the things that actually will be the attention. Now, is it fair? Probably not. Is it something that can be avoided? Also, probably not. Larry Sabato wrote a book called Feeding Frenzy. It was about how the press are like piranha. They smell blood in the water and they gather. It's a reality in politics. It can work for you, it can work against it. It's working against President Biden. You can complain it's not fair, but politics has never been fair. It's not about being fair. And so when you're in that position of heightened vulnerability, you really don't have a choice. You have to deal with the reality that's around you. And the reality is right now that Joe Biden has become a weakened candidate. My brother in 2004 wrote an article calling that election the Armageddon election.
Your brother is a well-known pollster.
John, my brother John, yeah. And almost every election since then has felt like that, but this one definitely is. It could very well be the end of the world, depending on the outcome. In that case, for God's sake, I want my best players on the floor. I don't want to have a situation where we say, if only. And so, for the sake of the country, for the sake of democracy, for the sake of the world, we need to have a good discussion. And when I wrote it weeks ago, I thought we could do it. Well, we did have a bit of a discussion, but President put the clamp down on it and said, no, it's still the drip, drip, drip continues. 7 more members of Congress, and I think there'll be more yet. How much longer does the agony have to continue before we say, let's do something right? And if we wait too long, like I said, it simply becomes a handoff, which I don't think has the same impact as if we made a decision on our own to act.
So if you had to put a number on it, what do you think are the percentage chances that Joe Biden will be nominated as the Democratic nominee at the convention?
I couldn't do it. I couldn't, Peter, at all. And I don't think that this is sustainable. I think it's in the interests of the party or the country that it be sustained. But he's braved it out so far. And I think that there's enough people adamant that he remain nervous about it. The party is polling about Kamala to see if she's somebody who could be a replacement and win. I don't think we'd know that from a poll right now. I think I would rather see, like I said, a compressed primary where people get to show their wares and engage on the stage with each other. I think that would strengthen her and strengthen whoever is in the mix with her. And it would showcase to the nation that there's a huge bench. People say, don't Democrats have anybody? Well, we do have somebody. But I was at the damn meeting and voted against getting rid of Iowa and New Hampshire because we knew what the game was. They don't like Iowa and New Hampshire because insurgents always do well.
Right.
because they
Right.
winnow the field, because those are two states where people get to look candidates in the eye and
Right.
get the measure of them
Right.
and ask them tough questions and get them to say things that maybe they wouldn't ordinarily say. They help us vet. They get to do what nobody else. When the thing moved to South Carolina, the
Mhm.
fix was in, and nobody got in the race except Dean Phillips. And
Right.
for a couple of weeks, Bobby Kennedy. Compressed primary would be better than no primary at all.
Right. Why do you think that people, whether it's Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or Hakeem Jeffries or Barack Obama, presumably the kinds of people that one would imagine would have influence over Joe Biden, have not done so? I mean, you're telling a story in which there's a consensus. I mean, you sound like you're saying that basically pretty much everybody believes that the Democrats would be better off with another candidate at this point. And yet the most powerful voices of the Democratic Party are not saying that publicly, and we have no evidence they're saying it even privately. So help us understand that.
Well, I think Nancy Pelosi's comments the other day were good.
But
You know,
strangely passive aggressive, right? I mean, Biden has said he's running. And so she said, we need Biden to give us an answer. I mean,
somebody
that's a
described her
very passive aggressive kind of thing to say.
somebody described her as a classic Italian American mother or grandmother saying to a child, if you keep doing that, it's not so much passive aggressive as it was tolerant and giving the child space to make the decision that he better make.
Right.
And that's what's a little bit disconcerting. Joe Biden deserves better than that.
Mm-hmm.
And those around him ought to know
Mm-hmm.
that he deserves better than that for himself. Look, I could put my Gaza, my Arab American hat on and say one thing, but I'm now thinking about my children, my grandchildren, the fate of the country, the environment, health and safety laws, Medicare, et cetera, and women's rights. I mean, I just don't want to see disaster befall us. And I think, to change metaphors, the clock has run out, the score's tied. The other team commits a technical foul and we got to put somebody on the foul line to take the shot. I want the best person to take that shot, not somebody who, when they go to the line, I'm going to be afraid, can they do it?
Yeah.
And hold my breath through a whole press conference. That's not where I want to be. I don't want to be holding my breath for my leader.
Right.
To be confident. I want to feel like I did when Bill Clinton would do a press conference or Barack Obama would do a press conference.
Right. So, okay. So Pelosi has kind of gone a little bit further than those other folks. But given that what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, and from the reporting, sounds like that's what most congressional Democrats actually believe, what is holding them back? Are they just afraid of the Biden campaign making them persona non grata? What is keeping these people from actually going out there and basically just forcing him out?
Part of it has to do with what's happened with political parties, period, in the country. I mean, look at why do Republicans who know Donald Trump is a madman, why do they fall in line? I think it's different a bit on the Republican side because there has been created a base of support. Donald Trump has played into the insecurity, the social, political, cultural dislocation that a whole lot of people feel, and they're grasping for something to give them certainty and give them a sense of somebody being with them. On the Democratic side, it's almost the reverse. It's the fear of Donald Trump. The fear of that has galvanized people around Joe Biden, that he's the guy that stands between us and chaos. And the fear of marching into uncertainty, having a situation where we have an untested, untried candidate. I think if we had done this a year ago, it would have been a very different thing. We would have had other candidates in the mix if they felt it was a level playing field. But when you didn't, then the question was, okay, that's what it is. I've got to make my peace with it, because the danger of losing him and having chaos and then losing an election is too great. And so it's the fear of Trump actually on both sides. It's what powers Republican elected officials to support him because they're afraid of the base.
Uh-huh.
And on the Democratic side, it's fear of the Republicans that silences them. And so the few people who have criticized me in the DNC have said, do you know what you're risking here? And I say back to them, do you know what you're risking here? I think that that's the more appropriate approach to take, that can we win under these terms? I don't want the next 4 months to be, did you hear him last night? Did you see what he said? Did you see what he mangled? The Republicans are already making the ads. You know it. I mean, Zelensky is Putin. Trump is vice president. The stare and the screen. Now, those could all be innocent gaffes, and they are. But when they build up, build up, build up, it becomes a
Right.
pattern and it becomes something that has now become a sort of a political and cultural meme. And
Right.
it's dangerous.
Right. And, I had a conversation with my son that was interesting about the debate, which just gave me a window into how this is experienced by people who get everything from social media, like young people. And I said, didn't you really think he was bad at the debate? And my son, who's 18, said, oh, he was the same as he always is. And I said, he's the same as he always is. And then he said, well, if you see him on TikTok and his Instagram, that's how he always looks. So he was basically being curated a feed of Joe Biden, which is constant moments like this of Joe Biden. So, but we have a question about the folks that do seem to be supporting Biden. I think one of the things that's been most interesting to me and also disturbing to me about this is that it seems that the people that Biden has been kind of leaning on in this moment to support him are the Congressional Black Caucus. And the Biden people have, it seems like at times, explicitly making this a kind of a racial issue. Again, particularly odd given that this could potentially lead to Kamala Harris. And then also members of the squad, not Rashida Tlaib, but I think AOC and Ilhan Omar. I think I saw them both say basically Biden's our guy. And I'm thinking, what do you mean Biden's your guy? And it's the moderates, it's the people in these swing districts, Ayanna Plesser, it's the swing district people in the more Trumpy kind of purple districts who've actually been the ones who've been going out and saying we need a new candidate. So help us make sense of this.
Look, in the case of Rashida, Ilhan, and Bernie, number one, Biden has pursued a progressive economic agenda, and Bernie has gotten a lot of what he'd hoped for in 2020 when they did the combined platform. And a lot of the other alternatives are quite centrist and would not pursue, he believes, the same agenda. I think that might explain that. But the others are afraid, including, I think, a lot of members of Congress. They're either asking him to step down because they're afraid, because look, my brother used to say that when these guys wake up in the morning, what they care about is not Ukraine, not Gaza, not nuclear holocaust. What they care about is whether they're going to win their election. That's the ultimate question here. And they're making their determination based on that. And the numbers don't look good right now. And when I hear, well, Senator such and such is doing 10 points better than the president, maybe that senator can lift the president up. And there's no such thing as reverse coattails. It doesn't work that way. Nobody goes and says, I'm voting for Congressman such and such. And oh, by the way, I'll go up. They go down. They don't go up. That's number one. Number two, I think that in the case of the Black Caucus, there is not a concern, but there is a commitment to Kamala Harris getting the first shot. And frankly, the longer Biden stays in, the better the chance that there won't be a competitive election and that Kamala will be the default candidate and that they feel she deserves it and you can't step over her. I think she'd win, like I said. I think she does deserve it, but I think she gets to be a stronger candidate viewed as more legitimate by the broader electorate if she's a part of a competitive process. So I have a difference with them on that. I've been called misogynist and racist by some, not in the party, but by people who would write me notes of that sort. And they're completely wrong. That's not the point. The point is that when I say there shouldn't be a handoff, I say it's better for her if it goes the other way. I think that pretty much sums up, look, there are three kinds of voters here. There's the, I love Donald Trump, I'm afraid of Donald Trump, and I don't give a shit. And those are the three. And what concerns me about this election are the number of people that say, I'm not going to vote. And I get mad when I see these head-to-head polls where you're in July or June and it's 47-47 or 48-45. And they do these pushing people to say, well, who would you likely vote for, whatever. And they only report that. There is no way that 95% of the American people have made their mind up right now. I mean, the more honest polls are 33-31, and the rest, other candidates are undecided. Undecided usually means I'm not going to vote. I don't care. And that's where a significant number of the electorate is. And when I look at the polls that we've done and look at the polls others have done and take a look at their crosstabs, what I'm finding is that the people who aren't that interested in voting, who aren't enthusiastic, are the Democratic base. That's where Black voters come in. That's where Latino voters come in. That's where that's where young people come in who don't have a strong party ID. Immigrant voters don't have a strong party ID. Look, 20% of African Americans today are immigrants. This is not the Democratic Party of the 1970s and 80s. This is a party where you got Nigerians and Ethiopians, and they have a very different feel about them. Victims of racism, to be sure, but also a very different kind of cultural heritage
Mhm.
that makes them less inclined to automatically vote Democrat. They're not going to vote for Donald Trump. They're not going to
Right.
vote at all.
Right.
I'll never
Right.
forget, just a side story. In the early 1970s, living in central Pennsylvania, Milton Shapp was a governor of the state, very progressive Democrat, as folks were back then, passed a law in Pennsylvania that he pushed for that unionized state college faculty and teachers and provided unions for public employees. He was a great guy. So I was going around doing door to door before a campaign, and I was looking at my charts, and I saw this one that I was going to go to, and it was an older woman. She was poor on Social Security. And I said, this is going to be easy. Knock on the door, just yes, Milton Shapp, and go to the next door. So I said, ma'am, I'm campaigning for Milton Shapp. And she said, Sonny, I don't vote. I said, but ma'am, Milton Shapp, he does this, he's provided. She said, Sonny, I told you I don't vote. I said, but he's the right choice in the Republic. She said, Sonny, I've been through Democrats, I've been through Republicans. I'm poor, I'm old, and it doesn't change. I'm just not voting. That's the way a lot of people feel right now. We can talk ad nauseum about all the great progress we've made, et cetera. But when too many young voters and Black voters and Latino voters and Asian voters say it doesn't matter, then we got a problem. And that's kind of where we are right now.
Yeah. There's been some reporting that suggests that the circle around Biden is particularly insular and kind of hostile to outsiders, and also very white and very old, frankly. And I'm just curious what your sense is about that inner circle and how they're interpreting what's going on and responding to it.
I've been in this town for almost 50 years now, started during the Carter years. This is the White House I've had the least contact with.
Hmm.
White House that has had the least contact with not just me, but with my community.
Hmm.
There's not been a single meeting of Arab Americans with the president. They'd have a meeting and they'd have a couple of Arabs there and they'd say, we met with Arab leaders. They didn't. They didn't. They specifically declined to have those meetings.
Why is that, do you think?
I don't know. I don't know. They had a problem in the Office of Public Engagement where the guy who was doing there would only do Muslim meetings. But even then, there was one Muslim meeting, a small group with the president, not to talk about Gaza, but to talk about Islamophobia, which I think is a misnomer in many ways. I remember talking with somebody else of great stature in the Democratic Party about this, and the person said, he hasn't met with you? And I said, no. And I said, doesn't surprise me, though, because I chair the ethnic council in the party. And I said, he hasn't met with Ukrainians. And the person was like, what? That's crazy. And I said, yeah, that's the case. I mean, 3 years in Ukraine, not a single meeting with Ukrainian Americans. And after Putin said what he did, why didn't the president bring in Eastern Europeans, Central Europeans, and say, let's talk? The policy and the politics combined, Bill Clinton would do this literally every other week. He'd be meeting with other constituent groups to let them know he cared and talk to them about what this is not a White House that operates that way. And frankly, I get concerned that too many of the NSC and too many of the State Department folks are staffers. People who staffed him in the Senate or staffed him as vice president. There's no Zbigniew Brzezinski's. There's no Brent Scowcrofts or even Henry Kissinger or Tony Lakes. There's no independent policy thinking people shaping this. These are good people, smart people, but they defer to the boss because that's where they come from. And I don't know who challenges what on anything, but we could talk about Gaza and the mess that it is. But for God's sake, I mean, this is the crunch time when you make a decision. Can we do this or not do this? And I think that continuing to say you're the only one who can do it, you're the only one who can do it, it's not a good time for that.
Yeah. Yeah. On this question about Gaza, it seems to me there's one potential line of argument that would say the stubbornness, the sense of disconnection from reality that Biden is showing in terms of the way he's refusing to step down, and he's not really seeming to be aware of the way he's perceived in the public, that maybe that's similar to the way he's approached the situation in Gaza. I can imagine another argument which would say, no, basically the problem with U.S. policy on the war in Gaza is basically just structural. It wouldn't have even mattered if Barack Obama had been there, who might have had more of an affinity and understanding of Palestinians. The structure of the power dynamics in Washington are such that you're not going to pick a fight with Israel, especially after October 7th. And so basically it wouldn't really have mattered if any other Democrat had been president. What do you think?
I think it's a little of both. The first is that this echo chamber, this closed
Mhm,
little circle
mhm,
where, look, I've been in situations before with other presidents and vice presidents where they'll do a screw up
mhm,
and you'll be in the room
mhm,
and how'd I do? You did
mhm,
great. You were wonderful, you know?
mhm,
And actually, I'd be the one who'd say, it didn't come off. And
mhm,
they'd say to me afterwards, staff would come, why'd you say that to him? And I'd say, because somebody had to tell him the damn truth.
mhm,
I'm not sure that people are telling him the truth. The hard stuff he needs to know you screwed up. It didn't work. You still are the leader. You're the only one. And I think that may be true about Gaza and Israel. I remember early on, I had a meeting with a senior person, and it was like 2 weeks after. And it
mhm,
was already clear the Amalek story had been out a couple times, and Gallant had said what he said. And the person said in his comments that this was trauma for the Jewish people, not just Israel, but for the Jewish people internationally. Created a sense of the pogroms and the Holocaust and the
mhm,
sense of vulnerability and the insecurity. And we've got to stand with them.
mhm,
So when I was asked to say something, I said, look, I completely understand that. I
mhm,
understand that fear and that insecurity and how it evokes those traumatic memories of the past. And I said, at the same time, understand that what's happening now to Palestinians is evoking trauma of its own. And so we have two traumatized people looking for an adult who can say, I understand both of you, and let's see. And I got back. That smacks of whataboutism. You're justifying. And I thought to myself, if these are the people who are advising, then this
mhm,
isn't advice at all.
mhm,
No advice at all. And I worried from mid-October. Conversation with Kamala Harris, on the other hand, was completely different. She
mhm,
gets it. She got it immediately. It comes from an entirely different world. And her
mhm,
comments the other day that were quoted in news reports about her understanding young women. I mean, she agonized over the kids and what they've experienced, and young girls having their periods and not having sanitary pads, and there's no sanitation. I mean, it indicated a depth of feeling that I have not seen from any of the people in the circle around the president other than her. I don't think she's in the loop in making some of these calls.
mhm,
I think there's a lack of empathy. I think
mhm.
there's a lack of understanding of Palestinians as real people. He is locked in an old world.
Right.
He's still the Golda Meir,
Yeah.
Yitzhak Rabin Democrat. And so there is that structural thing, but there's
Yeah.
also the broader, I think, mistake in the party
Yeah.
that if we do this, we lose the Jewish vote,
Right.
which is bullshit because there's a way to frame this issue. You can't have a Jewish community that is furious with Netanyahu over X,
Mhm,
Y, and Z,
mhm,
and yet wants to give him a blank check to do what he's doing. There's a way to frame that if you had imagination to create a sense this is not good for Israel at all, period. Let's get on with it and change this policy. But we've actually fed Netanyahu and fueled his sense of impunity rather than the other way around and shown no real compassion for Palestinians at all.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I mean, I wonder how much of it is a concern about Jewish voters and how much of it is a concern about Jewish donors. But I think that
Look at the donors who are pulling
I
out.
know, but in a weird way, that almost makes them more than reliant on the Chaim Sabans or whatever, who maybe don't care whether Joe Biden has it together as long as he's pursuing the policy they want.
And oh,
Um,
by the way, about votes, what I forgot is that if you look at the polling, the people we're losing
hmm,
are Democrat. I said that before, but
right.
this policy is going to damage Democrats for a long time to come.
Yeah.
Jamal Bowman is not going to sit easy with black voters.
Right.
Uh,
So, do you think, from a political perspective, again, as someone who is immersed in the Arab American community, if the Democrats were to nominate Harris, or let's say they were to nominate somebody else, does that mean that there are people who said, I will not vote for Joe Biden because of Gaza, who might be willing to vote for Kamala Harris, or for that matter, Gretchen Whitmer or whatever? Or do you think that those people are essentially lost to any Democratic candidate?
I think a number of them are lost. The damage has been done.
Mhm.
38,000 dead, 9 months and counting. There's damage. But there are enough people, I think, who could be brought over if there were a message that was compassionate, firm on how to end this. I think it could be done. And it would not only, like I said, have an impact with Arab American voters, but it would have an impact on many of those younger voters who are equally distraught over the Gaza policy and have become alienated from the White House over that policy, which in my reckoning is the first time I've ever seen that you have a focus group with young black voters who say, I'm not voting for him because of Gaza. I mean, that's never been done before.
Right.
and young progressive Jews and young people generally, right, having a sense that with their global consciousness that this president has been damaging to values they care about.
Yeah. As someone who understands democratic politics in Washington really, really well for a long time, help me understand this. As you're saying, clearly the question of Palestinian freedom has a salience among progressives now that it has never had. More people care about it of all different kinds of backgrounds. And people are actually organizing around it, whether it's on the encampments or there are protests everywhere and the uncommitted. And yet, at the level of electoral congressional politics, Jamal Bowman just lost. It's not like any of these AIPAC Democrats, as far as I know, are facing challengers on this issue. They're safe. It's the small number who care about Palestinian humanity who are more in danger. And there's no institution that is giving money to candidates that is actually able to seeming right now to translate all of that popular energy and concern into the stuff of actual politics, money, or just enough people to ring doorbells to actually really change things. Why is that transmission not happening, or is it just too early and we'll see it in a decade or two?
The observation is correct, but it is too early. This is
Mm-hmm.
the first election since this issue has come to a head the way it has. Mm-hmm. It dragged on for a long time. But look, I don't believe that we'll ever be in a position where we have $15-20 million to spend to defeat somebody. I don't think we will. Yet we have done significant fundraising for Jamal, for
Mm-hmm.
Corey,
Mm-hmm.
for Rashida, for others around the country that we've supported. It's not like we haven't been, but at the point where we get to raise the kind of money that gets raised in 2024, people are spending money in an obscene way that we've never seen before.
Right.
And it's Republican money and it's billionaire money.
Right.
It's a Jeffrey Yass who funds the center in Israel that writes Netanyahu's judicial reform plan, creating PACs to intervene in Democratic elections. The Summer Lee one, AIPAC could say, well, we had nothing to do with that. It was Jeffrey Yass. Well, that's you just with another name. Or the Dan Davis one beating Fauci. I mean, these are Republicans with billions playing in the Democratic world to squash progressives in order to support Israel. I don't think we'll ever be there. And frankly, we haven't that kind of money to play. And I'm sorry to say this, and this is not a trope, but for those who condemned Ilhan Omar for saying it's about the Benjamins, AIPAC just showed in this election it was about the Benjamins. That's what happened here. They spent millions to defeat Jamal. Now, think about this. Why did they go after Jamal and not Rashida and not Ilhan in this election? They did so because he was vulnerable. He was vulnerable because he got redistricted. And the district that he was in, the person who was part of the state planning that did the drawing of the lines, George Latimer was a part of that as county executive and part of the folks that did the redistricting map, gave himself a more favorable district and cut a lot of black areas out of Jamal's district. And so going back to Findlay, going back to Percy, going back to other races that AIPAC has used as that era's dead dog that they put on the front lawn and say, this could happen to you too, the sort of the mafia threat thing. They wanted a sacrificial lamb, and Jamal was ripe for the plucking. And they used those millions to define him as a caricature. Somebody said to me, if his mom had been watching TV and looking at the Jamal Bowman ads, she wouldn't have voted for her son either. They made him into a nightmarish person. If Jamal had had that kind of money and could have done the same to George Latimer, he had said as many things that were atrocious, more things, whatever, it would have been a very different race. But the problem here is not that we have as much money to spend, but that we get big money out of politics. Because what AIPAC did in this round, believe me, will be replicated in the future by big pharma, by big oil, by NRA, by anti-abortion groups. People will realize you can spend millions and end up not having to defeat everybody.
Right.
Because now the numbers are too large. There's like 80 people supporting Palestinian rights in Congress. If you defeat a couple, you spread fear. And that's what they want to do, is create fear.
Right. Yes, it's a horrible system. And I wish there were not so many right-wing Jewish billionaires, or if they had to be billionaires, I wish they weren't right-wing. And if they have to be right-wing, I wish they weren't billionaires. It's a very unfortunate combination. But I guess, I mean, this is maybe a silly question, but Arab Americans and separately Muslim Americans. I mean, these very successful communities, very highly educated. Where are those billionaires to basically come in and put $1 million down on the table and say, fuck you, Chaim Saban, I'm going to play this game too?
Look, a long time ago, we thought about this. Number one, we don't have billionaires, and the billionaires are in the Arab world. And frankly, that would be untoward to put their money into politics, which is actually a trope that we were subjected to when we do an Arab American fundraiser. They say he's getting Arab money. It was Arab American money. But number two, if that's ever going to happen, I'm not going to be the one to do it, because I remember people saying we need to get big, and I'd say no. I mean, I want campaign finance. I don't want to do to them what they've done to us. That's not the way I want politics to run. And so I'm not going to go to the folks we have who have hundreds of millions and say, let's raise this money to destroy that other person. I can think of people right now in my mind's eye who I would love to see go down in flames, but I don't want to play politics that way. I supported McCain-Feingold, loved what they did. Russ Feingold was just a really good guy. And John McCain, when he talked about campaign finance, it was important. Supreme Court screwed it up, and nobody's had the guts to fix it. They're taking advantage of a loophole in a way that I think is detrimental to the democracy that we're in, as detrimental as what Donald Trump is doing or threatening to do. And yet I'm not going to engage in that game at all.
Do you think that Donald Trump's policy towards Palestinians would be significantly worse than Joe Biden's?
I think his policy toward everything would be significantly worse than with Palestinians. What he said is they should just finish the job. I don't know what the hell that means, but it sounds pretty ominous to me. And I think his domestic policy toward Arabs and Muslims, and in particular Palestinians, I mean, if you have groups that have influence with him going around saying, if you support Palestinian rights, you're Hamas. I mean, I've been told I'm Hamas or I'm Hezbollah, which is a weird place for a Lebanese Christian to be. And he wants to expel them or punish them. And we're getting these laws passed by Democrats, in addition to Republicans, are supporting them, that are basically criminalizing speech and criminalizing behavior. Donald Trump would accelerate that. And so, yeah, he worries me a lot. At least on the Democratic side, we have allies that we can work with, allies who care about what we care about and will join with us and fight with us. We have an obligation to fight with them as well on issues that they care about. But on the Republican side, right now, we don't have allies. And there are no allies. And the ones that we might have would be anti-Semites, except they're anti-Semites for Israel. And they will feign, well, we really like you people because, you know what they're like. But then they're the ones who want to send more weapons to Israel to finish the job because the final days are at hand. I mean, this is a weird Republican Party today. This is not the Republican Party of Dwight Eisenhower or George Herbert Walker Bush or even Ronald Reagan. This is a different breed. So on the Democratic side, we got a lot of friends, and I want to keep building those friendships and relationships. And Donald Trump, I think, would be a threat to all of us.
Yeah. I mean, I know this is probably not an argument that would convince many people, but I do think if one were to make the argument for voting for Biden, even despite the horrors of his Gaza policy, I think it seems to me you could argue that, A, he faces some pressure from Democrats in Congress to shift that policy more towards conditioning and cutting off aid, whereas Trump would face no pressure from Republicans in Congress in that regard. And also that I think AOC at this point about basically the question is, under which president are you more likely to be able to organize? So as unsympathetic as Biden has been to all of the protests, I would imagine that in a Trump presidency, the legal and other kinds of crackdowns on any kind of protest, whether it's for Palestinians or anything else, will be much more severe. And so the possibilities of legally organizing to try to change U.S. policy would be more constrained than they are now, given his authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And I'm fearful that we don't gain control of the House, that we lose the Senate. And there's a lot at stake in this election because of that very fact. I mean, look, I would love to have control of the Senate. I worry about the judges that are coming up the line. Yeah. I worry about the harassment of Democrats that would occur. They're now subpoenaing people, staff in the White House, to find out about his health records. I mean, these guys are ruthless. We saw what they could do during Obama's period. With a Donald Trump at the helm, they'd be literally out of control. And it would be a scary day for America.
So last question, Jim. So I imagine you've been asked this many times over the years, going back to when you supported Jesse Jackson, and you've been a very loyal supporter of a Democratic Party that hasn't always treated you and your community very well. And there's now obviously a tremendous amount of alienation towards Biden and even towards the Democratic Party among progressives, at least those progressives who care about the war in Gaza in particular. So what do you say to people when they say, Jim, why are you spending all this time working inside the Democratic Party? This party isn't really worth your efforts.
Um, Story. 1968, Julian Bond came to the convention as head of a delegation of Georgians that was a mixed delegation. As a civil rights leader, he'd pushed for it and won a mixed delegation. The all-white Georgia party came with their delegation, so they had to go to the credentials committee. Julian fought, Julian won, and there was a mixed Georgia delegation for the first time at the Democratic Convention. Second day was the platform, and Julian was one of the few folks who crossed over from civil rights to anti-war like King and led the fight against the war in Vietnam and the resolution to oppose the war, and it lost. And there was unrest in the convention, but as you recall, there was also lots of unrest out on the street. The third night, there was the nomination for vice president, and progressives, that is the civil rights and anti-war people, put up Julian Bond for vice president. He wasn't old enough to be vice president at the time. He was only 34, I think. And trouble ensued in the convention. I remember his white, staid, Rhode Island delegates standing on their chairs chanting, Julian Bond, Julian Bond. And that's when Daley brought the cops into the convention to beat up delegates, et cetera. The final night of the convention, Muskie, the nominee, vice president nominee, came out, and Humphrey came out, gave their speeches, the balloon drop, and Julian Bond comes from behind the screen and holds the hands of both up. I didn't know Julian at the time, but I got to know him in 1973, I think it was. And we were talking one day. I was driving him someplace, and I said, why'd you do that? You really devastated us. Why'd you do that? He said, look, there's two kinds of people. There are people who will sit up on their pinnacles above the whole mess in the world, and they'll say, I can't be bothered with that. It's got to get worse before I get involved. I'm not going to get into the muck of things. And he said, and then there's the people who get down in the muck and work because they see people suffering and they want to make something a little bit better, even though they know they're never going to solve it, but they can try to do it as best they can. He said, I have to be a part of that. That's who I am. And then he said, at that point, it was no longer Julian Bond versus Ed Muskie. It wasn't Julian Bond versus Hubert Humphrey. It was Hubert Humphrey versus Richard Nixon. There was no place for me to be but making sure that we won that election. Too much was at stake. That's how I felt in almost every election since then. I wasn't a big fan of Hillary Clinton. I supported Bernie. But at some point you say, this is what the choice is. It's not the choice I want. It's the choice I've got. And I've got to make a choice. And frankly, there is no third party in America. And it's too important for me to go on a joyride with a Jill Stein or with a Ralph Nader, who I had enormous respect for, but was never going to be a part of that. Because we had to beat George Bush in that election, and we didn't. And if you think for a minute that we would have had the disaster of the Iraq War and Afghanistan and occupations of both countries and Paul Bremers and whatever, trying to dig a hole so deep that we've never gotten out of it. With Al Gore as president, never would have happened that way. I mean, even if Democrats are just a little bit better, that little bit better means a lot in terms of the long term and the suffering that it creates. And so I make a choice. And my choice is fight within the Democratic Party, try to change the Democratic Party, try to create a space for reasoned debate on important issues, which is what I'm trying to do right now. And people call me Sisyphus. They call me Charlie Brown in the football. But you know what? If it's there, I'm going to try. If the rock is at the bottom of the hill, I don't have a choice. I've got to do something to try to pick it up and make it go up the hill. I know it's never going to work, but I still have to try because there's way too much at stake to not try at all. And so I keep saying, maybe this time, maybe this time. And I thank you so much, Peter, for having me on. And thanks all of you for listening.
Thank you so much for doing this.
And if people have questions that they didn't get to, if you write to me at jzogby@aaiusa.org, I'd be happy to respond. Thank you.
Absolutely. Next week, we're again going to be at Friday at 11. Our guest is going to be Leila Al Arian, who's an executive producer at a show on Al Jazeera called Fault Lines. But in particular, she's coming to talk about the documentary that she was the executive producer on, which is called The Night Doesn't Come. It's a very, very powerful film. And so she's going to talk about the issues associated with making that film, which is set in Gaza mostly, although it has a little bit about Washington as well. I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Shabbat Shalom.